Well, when a railroad abandons its line and a trail group negotiates an interim use agreement, numerous legal issues can surface for the abutting landowners, including everything from fences and trash to personal liability. Roger McEowen with Washburn School of Law joins us now to review recent cases involving rail-to-trail issues. Roger, it's always a pleasure. A little background on the rail banking process and what's involved here.
Well, good to be with you, Suzanne. It is indeed a process that at the end, it allows the railroad to negotiate with another entity, which would then assume the financial and managerial responsibility for that abandoned corridor by operating a recreational trail on it. But before the trail operator can start negotiating with the railroad, it has to file a rail banking petition. And they have to state that they're willing to assume full responsibility for managing the right-of-way. They're going to assume legal liability for the transfer of the use of the right-of-way. They have to pay any and all taxes associated with that right-of-way and acknowledge that the railroad still has the possibility of putting the trackage back in light of any possible national emergency. It's only once you get to the end of that process that the notice of interim trail use or an NITU will be issued, and that'll allow the railroad to discontinue service, and then the trail can operate, a recreational trail.
This is so interesting that they can go back and forth like this. Talk about some of the legal issues that can arise when a trail group does negotiate an interim use agreement.
Well, just because of the fact that they can go back and forth like that creates a big property issue. But you mentioned in your open that there are other issues associated with that, such as fence maintenance and trash cleanup and personal liability. What if I've got a longhorn, Texas longhorn steer in my pasture that's right up against that corridor, and now I've got kids and their families using that corridor? I'm concerned as the livestock owner for potential liability. So those are some of the issues that are there. But a big one would be the property right associated with that corridor. Once that rail line abandons its usage, shouldn't the corridor revert back to all the abutting landowners along that line? And that's actually a huge issue as to whether there actually is a reversion of that interest to the abutting landowners or not.
Speak to how that works. You know, obviously taking some easement on that land ownership there and having that butt up to those rail or trail lines. Examples of recent cases here that kind of played out and how it played out.
Yeah, Suzanne, that's actually the issue as to whether the railroad in the original grant was given an easement or whether they had fee simple outright ownership of that. If they had fee simple ownership, then the railroad can do what it wants with the abandoned corridor. They can convey it, they can sell it, they can transfer, they can deal with a recreational trail, whatever. But if they only received a grant of an easement, then you have to read the easement terms, because it's likely at the end of that easement, in terms of the usage for railroad purposes, that there would be a reversion back to the abutting landowners that granted that easement initially. And there was a recent case out of the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals involving a 144-mile-long trail in Missouri, and that's what the court found, that the railroad was granted an easement. Conversion to a trail was not within the scope of the original easement, which was for railroad purposes. Once they ceased operating for railroad purposes, that land needed to come back to the abutting landowners. And so the case was remanded back for determination of how much is going to have to be paid, because that's a compensable taking under the Fifth Amendment takings clause.
So much great information, as always. He is the man you want to talk to. Roger McEowen, always a pleasure. Of course, with the Washburn School of Law. Appreciate you joining us, as always.